one of our issue-based questions, which is about gun violence. So here at UTEC, we advocate for gun violence prevention. For example, in last year's budget, we successfully got $10 million to do this work. This funding would help support nonprofits statewide. With that in mind, would you support this statewide funding in your budget? Yes or no, and why?
So the short answer is yes, but I want to give a little context because the Attorney General does have a budget, but you really work with local municipalities, you work with the state legislature, so your senator, your rep, your mayors, your councilors, to push for investment for youth development organizations such as this. When I was on the city council in Boston, so I live in Mattapan in Boston, I represented Dorchester and Mattapan. One of my first hearings was on youth development programs and pushing the city of Boston to fund those programs. And now because of my work, we now have what we call Youth Development Fund. I think other municipalities could have that, and I think, of course, other state budgets should also have appropriations for programs like this. And the AG can also support with resources as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Question two is going to be about housing. As justice-involved young adults, access to housing has become an interest to us. Many of us, because of our backgrounds, find it difficult to find places to live that are affordable and that would even consider renting to us. Can you share your vision with us about affordable and accessible housing?
There's a lot an AG can do. One is, so I mentioned my work on the city council outside of youth development programs. The other was housing. So my first piece of legislation was what they call the Community Preservation Act. That's still generating now $20 million for the city of Boston to create affordable housing and also access to green space. If I could do that at the local level where there's very little resources for a councilor, you don't have a lot of staff. In AG's office, you have hundreds of lawyers, hundreds of staff, a bigger budget. I think you have to get out there and push for legislative solutions like the CPA and others to fund housing that is affordable, but not just rental opportunities. I strongly believe in homeownership opportunities, including for young people. You can build well and you can start young. And I think there's a way to stress that. Discrimination is a big part of housing. And AG uniquely positioned to take that on. So if you have quarries, or if you're a person of color, even if you have a disability, whatever it is, we are seeing that there's discrimination in that in the context of housing. Even if you have a family, lead paint discrimination is a big deal. And AG can take all of that on to ensure folks have access to housing that is affordable. And the other piece I would mention, outside of using the tools of the office to make sure people are not discriminated against and that there's more production of housing at pricing points that people can afford, there are a whole bunch of programs that exist in Massachusetts that help people create wealth. It's usually through housing, because if you have a house as your first asset, you can take wealth out of that house to start a business. And so how do we make sure that programs like this are connected to those wealth building programs? How do we make sure that people know about it? How do we push government, frankly, to get out of the way when folks are trying to do these programs? When I was on the City Council of Boston, we brought in a program that does wealth building that was started in Lynn into the public housing in Boston. It took 2 years. That's ridiculous. It shouldn't take that long. And so I think there's a whole host of ways to help people have access to housing. And I'm a first-time homeowner in Mattapan.
Oh, wow.
And for me, to talk about breaking cycles, my two boys, we grew up in public housing. When I grew up, we grew up in affordable housing. Now I'm breaking that cycle for my kids. I think others should have access to the same opportunity. Thank you.
So we're going to go on to our next question, which is about justice. As you know, there are individuals in the state who are currently doing time because of cannabis. Cannabis has become legalized, yet it continues to negatively impact our communities because of incarceration. Would you consider expunging all cannabis possession convictions, and why? In your opinion, why hasn't that happened yet?
Lack of political courage, lack of folks in positions of power, elected positions of power, that understand why it's significant to expunge those records. So I'm running for an office where there's never been a person of color. There's never been anyone with my story in this office. And so you bring a unique lens when you come with a personal narrative and with experience, you are invested in it in a different way. Absolutely expunge those records. It's ridiculous that people even still are getting caught up in the system because of it. I think it goes hand in hand with some of the quarry reform. I think we need better implementation of the quarry reform too, while we also push for expungement of records. Not just in this context, other contexts too. If you were a juvenile and you did things way back when, that shouldn't haunt you for the rest of your life if you
Right.
made a conscious decision to make different choices going forward.
Thank you. I love that answer. So this is going to be our last issue-based question, number 4. It's about police accountability. During COVID, there was a racial uprising, and we saw firsthand what can happen to an individual in the hands of law enforcement. What would you do about officers who have a history of using their power? Would you help keep such individuals accountable for their actions?
Yes, the short answer is yes, and I've been telling everyone there are 3 candidates running for Attorney General. If you care about policing reform, transparency, accountability, even the lack of diversity within our policing systems, I'm your candidate. I'm the only candidate to have done the work to actually push the envelope on what's possible when it comes to policing reform. So on the City Council in Boston, I chaired the Committee on Public Safety and Criminal Justice. I actually expanded it to include conversations around criminal legal reform, what's happening behind the wall, conditions of confinement, solitary confinement. I think you can't have a conversation about policing reform without also having a conversation around what's happening in our prisons and juvenile justice. That being said, because we're focusing just on police accountability, we now in Boston have body cameras. The community pushed for it when I got to the council.
Yeah.
It wasn't implemented. We now have that as a permanent thing in the city of Boston. Other communities can have that too. It protects civilians, but it also protects officers. We now have the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency in Boston with the Civilian Review Board attached to it. That's a game changer. It's historic. It has never happened in Massachusetts. I helped draft the legislation to create that office. So I think as Attorney General, you need to make these issues statewide, work with municipalities not only on body cameras and other accountability tools. Every municipality could have an Office of Police Accountability and Transparency. They call it OPAC. Every community can have that. But the AG, if a community doesn't have it, you have the legal staff, the authority to make sure that if someone is abusing their power, whether it's a public safety agent or somebody else that works in government, that they're held accountable. And I would actually go further and create a unit within the AG's office to look at those types of cases specifically to truly get accountability and systemic reform across Massachusetts. It's not just an issue that shows up in urban settings, rural communities as well. I was on a Zoom with a town of 800 folks, and all they talked about was policing reform.
Yeah.
And this is a community predominantly white. And so these issues also show up in other communities. So how do we make sure as a statewide office that you're bringing everyone into the fold to really push for reform? And not just the local police departments, the state police too, which often is a part of the conversation. And then lastly, I do a lot of work on diversity. If we are going to have true community policing, you need officers that are women, people of color, that speak different language, are culturally competent. These are good paying jobs that folks in the community should have access to. Major work still to do in a lot of municipalities to promote diversity, including at the state police, which I care deeply about.
Thank you. So this is going to be our last 2 questions, really. They're pretty short and sweet, yes or no questions based on budget advocacy. So at UTEC, we work on advocacy locally, statewide, and coalitions. We even go up to the State House to advocate for young adults statewide and their services. Would you support our work advocating through the legislative cycle and budgetary cycle of the State House through writing written testimonies and participating on advocacy days with us? Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you.
And I'll continue to show up in your communities too.
We would love that.
It's
Thank
important.
you. It really is. Question 2, would you help us highlight issues at the state level like raising the age for juvenile convictions, expanding expungement, and housing for formerly incarcerated individuals? Yes or no?
Yes. And I just have to add one point. I started my career as a lawyer representing young people in education cases. My youngest client was 6, my oldest was 22. And I try to follow folks past 22, because at that age, many services cut off in the educational context. I did that work for free, so most of the families had to fall below, or did fall below the poverty line. But if you're taking on those type of cases, whether it's students with IEPs, a lot of school discipline cases to keep young people in school, there was a lot of policy work around how you dismantle this cradle to prison pipeline, or cradle to deportation pipeline. I care deeply about that issue. I think it's a place where the Attorney General can be doing a lot more. There's also a Community Engagement Bureau in the AG's office. It needs to be expanded. We need to hire more people. We need to hire more young people. even folks who are formerly gang involved, whatever it is, if you're going to break any type of cycle, people with the lived experience also need to be at the table. So I'll advocate with you, but I also want to surround myself with folks who lived a life and who are in a position or want to be in a position to be able to break those cycles too, so they can be the advocates. And you stand alongside them, or frankly, you stand behind them.
Right. Thank you, that was beautiful.
Thank you.
To finish us off, this is our last question, but one we really want your view on. What is your vision for supporting emerging adults who are justice involved like us?
Hire you, and not just, bring you in and sit on a commission and volunteer your services, share your story, and then I say hello and you leave. I truly believe in, if you're going to be an effective leader, you surround yourself with other leaders, young people leaders. If we're going to really break cycles of violence, I've never been gang involved. How am I the best positioned to go into a community to break those cycles? I'm not. So I need to hire folks who either are or formerly were, who want to make a difference. Hire young people in particular. We're going to be talking about you. You need to be at the table. But in addition to the hiring piece, what are your ideas? We often get the questions, what's your vision for X? What's your vision for housing? What's your vision for criminal legal reform, policing reform, or anything else? I flip the question. What's your vision for housing?
Right.
What's your vision for what does a safe community look like for you? What does a high quality education look like for you?
Yeah.
And I think that policy making, the co-creation of policy together is critical. So have you at the table, hire you, but also be serious about creating policy that is informed by folks living it every day and who want to be a part of the solutions.
Yep. Thank you. I
Thank you.
appreciate it a lot. So really
Thank
just
you.
end us off. Can we take a picture with you, please?
Absolutely. Should we take a group one?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.